Hello, welcome to another book report. Um, Interesting book. Not maybe not on the great category, but I enjoyed it. I read it. The Rule of Laws: A 4,000-Year Quest to Order the World by Fernanda Pirie or Pirie. Sorry, I'm mispronouncing your last name, I'm sure. Pirie, maybe. Depends what. I think she teaches in England. Perry, maybe. Anyway, um, a little long, a little repetitive, but very interesting. I think I did skip a little bit at the end, as I recall, but not. The beginning was fascinating. I love history, and she covered most of recorded history from a law and legal perspective, which was fascinating. I've never really read anything from that perspective in terms of just sort of plain old history. And then the second and third sections kind of get into more of the implications and how it applies to societies and the modern world. Anyway, definitely not for everybody, but I think anyone who appreciates the rule of law, or just history in general, would enjoy it if you're interested in those topics. It's pretty well written. Like I said, it's a little repetitive, but that's more the editor's job, I think, than than anything. Anyway, so let's get right into it. So we have a good summary here on page 311. Okay, so since the first lawmakers wrote out grand statements on stone slabs, people have repeatedly turned to law in the search for justice, not least by controlling the powers of their judges and officials. Objective rules offer a sense of certainty that there is a right way to do things. The reasons for such an endeavor may be utterly pragmatic, such as the desire to establish and regulate mercantile relations through commercial laws, but laws may promise justice and confirm autonomy, sometimes by consolidating local customs, as they did among the Irish, the Icelanders, the Indian communities, and the Dagrestani tribes. Laws can also create a sense that, by observing their rules, people are participating in a wider cosmological order or following God's path for the world, as they did for those who observed the great religious systems. But in most legal systems, the laws also defined and limited how power should be exercised, giving people at least the possibility of challenging the actions of those who govern them. This is the rule of law, a dynamic that has run through history since the time of Hammurabi. Only in China did the emperors who presided over a disciplinary system resist this idea. So I think that's a fascinating, or a good summary of what I think is a fascinating topic. Particularly the give and take, and how systems of explicit written public, clearly defined public laws can be used to limit power, or can be an instrument to limit power, in my opinion, and that China is kind of the one big exception in that area, which I think is extremely informative for the modern world and important to keep in mind. So, then we go to page 343. So this was interesting too. I think I never really thought. I mean, I haven't actually read Hobbes or Locke since high school, so maybe it's time to revisit. But I really appreciated this little nugget in terms of how colonialism was kind of baked into even some of the more famous liberal voices, small l, in the past. So philosophers, well, let's skip Hobbes. Argued that property rights, while John Locke, in Second Treatise on a Government, 1689, linked property rights firmly to cultivation. It followed that if the indigenous people were not cultivating their land, only hunting over it, settlers could legitimately move in. Once they had begun to lay out fields to, quote, mix their labor with the land, close quote, in Locke's terms, the new occupiers had right to possession. So I think that's fascinating, and also shows ignorance of hunter-gathering societies. I mean, hunters do interact with the land. What's the quote again? Mix their labor with the land. I mean, if hunting isn't labor in and of itself, then I don't know what is. Also, many North American cultures radically reshaped their environment to increase deer populations, create more edge, right? So they would do purposeful burning to create borders between woods and unwooded areas to increase the deer population. So anyway, just because you're hunting over land doesn't mean you're not mixing your labor with the land. Anyway, but the bottom line is that it's fascinating how baked in colonialism was to all kinds of thinking back then. And to a certain degree still is. I mean, we're still decolonizing our thinking and ways of doing things today still, of course. Okay, now we're on to 363. Oh, yes. Last two sentences. So it talks about, okay, so resourceful Indians, as in from India, learned to live with the new political order, and high caste Bengali Hindus were able to profit from the new framework of landed property rights, entering the world of commerce and trade and sending their sons to acquire an English education in Calcutta. Many supported the British in their wars with Napoleon, and one Indian, Ram Mohan Roy, born in 1772, launched an ambitious and influential movement to reform traditional Indian practices such as widow burning. In the long run, familiarity with English ideas about rights and liberty gave Indian nationalists the confidence to stand up to personal indignities and complain that the privileges of English law were confined to the ruling classes. From the early 19th century, they consistently used the language of law and rights in their agitation for self-determination, which they did not achieve until 1947, I think, maybe 48. So while I appreciate her argument, and we'll cover this in the next quote, I think, that laws can be used to exercise power, but also to limit power. Clearly, they can only limit power by groups of people that have at least some power. Right? If your group is completely without any kind of countervailing power, as the great modern economist whose name is escaping me would talk about. Anyway, if you don't have countervailing power, if you don't have any basis for fundamental power, you can't really use the law to limit the power of others. Right, so you need law in and of itself is not a power, but it can be used by groups that have some power to limit the power of other groups, right? So like in the U.S., workers have used the law to limit the rights of employers and to be treated like human beings, right? Back in the 1800s and into the 1900s. So anyway. I appreciated that quote and some of those ideas. 397, last full sentence. Oh, yeah. So here she's talking about how many cultures don't really have formal laws. They have mediators and other individuals that are empowered to resolve conflicts between parties or families. and that and one of these mediators was complaining. He was saying, one mediator pointed out, the government system does not, quote, do justice, close quote. It gives nothing to the victim. So, and I that really rang a bell, particularly in terms of the restorative justice movements in many countries today, including the U.S. And that we need to. I really appreciated that from a more mediation-centered culture versus judicial cultures that most of us live in today, in that we do need to incorporate actual, what does the victim of this crime really need and want to heal, to move on, to get a sense of justice, right? Just punishing the perpetrator isn't necessarily really helping the victim at all. So, and we have some of that, of course, compensation and the civil court system, but I think we need a lot more of that. Restorative justice, things like that. All right. Right, and then legalistic practices can limit power, but and avoiding them can lead to autocracy. But that assumes that the group using it to limit power has at least some power. You can, the law in and of itself isn't going to do it. People have to empower the law. First paragraph. Oh, I skipped that one too. 253. Oh, okay. 453. First paragraph. Right. So I thought this was worth reading. Okay, so and this speaks to the idea that the law in and of itself doesn't have power. People and communities give it power. Laws do not possess any inherent power for good or for evil. Over history, many legal projects have been thoroughly cynical and manipulative. The Germanic kings were trying to acquire power and status of Roman emperors. Hammurabi was a ruthless warlord who wanted to bequeath a benign image for posterity. Lawmaking priests and their institutions often amass power and resources for their own benefit. Authoritarian leaders regularly cite the law to legitimate their actions, and contemporary governments try to convince us that they are more in control of a crisis than they really are. A vision for civilization, competence, and human rights may be a screen for ambition and greed or simply power. But visions and screens only work if people believe in the values they project. And once laws set out a vision that people believe in, they can also be used against any power holder who tries to ignore them. This is what gives law its ability to both legitimate and limit power. But again, only when wielded by groups that have some underlying power, either the ability to vote or just the fact that the vast majority of people in that culture believe that that's the right way to do things. And then 453. Oh no, I'm sorry, 455. Yeah. So, and then here we get back to China, which I think is one of the more interesting revelations to me in this book, is that out of all the legal traditions, well, let's read it. The exception, as so often, has been China. Here, for centuries, powerful emperors managed to avoid the rule of law by claiming that they were both the source of their elaborate legal system and the ultimate object of its protection. Their achievement was to establish a sense not just that social order depended upon the discipline they could impose through punitive laws, but that they themselves were the representatives of heaven. They combined the roles of king and priest, the forces of might and right, in a pattern that endured through successive dynasties, and that no other ruler had been able to emulate so successfully or for so long. The European doctrine of the divine right of kings had a very short life. Unscrupulous leaders have repealed their laws, sacked their judges, closed the madrasas, or just declared, as Ayatollah Khomeini did, that they were above the law. but none has had the success of the Chinese rulers. Even now in China, the idea of, quote, the rule of law implies the obligation of government officials to abide by the state's rules rather than by acting as an explicit constraint on party leaders. This is rule by law, not the rule of law. That paragraph should probably be read by anyone who wants to understand modern China and the thinking of the CCP. It's brilliantly stated. There is no rule of law in China. It's ruled by law, right? I mean, the law is whatever the CCP says it is at that moment, and it could change tomorrow, right? So it's, however, that being said, another bit of Chinese history that she didn't really go into is the mandate of heaven, the concept of the mandate of heaven. So there is a check on imperial power in Chinese history. It just was like the big veto. It was the big, sort of like if the imperial family has lost the mandate of heaven, then they're no longer fit to rule, and another imperial family needs to come in and take over, basically. So there was no, and that usually involved violence, sometimes on a very large scale. So, not a good way to run things over time, right? I mean, the peaceful transition of power is a big deal. But anyway, all I'm getting at is that historically there was a check to a certain degree, but it was sort of the big check, the big time, like you've totally lost all the mandate of heaven. It doesn't have the small checks on power and the countervailing power system that countries like the United States have used so successfully up until recently, at least, and hopefully into the future for the last 150 years or more. So anyway, fascinating that China is such a outlier in terms of law, and the fact that their rulers resisted the idea that they were under, that the law applied to them too, and that's the only long-term system in which the rulers denied that the law applied to them, which is very informative for how we need to be thinking about and dealing with the CCP and the Chinese leadership today. So, but anyway, this is not at all about China. I mean, she obviously does cover China significantly, but it's more of a history and very interesting, very enlightening. Okay, well, until next time, happy reading.